Christian, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I hear an echo. I'm sorry. Do you hear an echo?
I don't, but that's why I just muted immediately. I don't hear an echo.
Can I get us started? And I'm sorry I'm not on camera, but I need to pick my daughter up, so I want to get our meeting started. Is our vice chair on?
Commissioner Richardson, he said he should be joining shortly. He just got home, but that was like a couple minutes ago, so it should be getting situated.
All right. Can I get us started and then he can take us
Absolutely.
tonight?
Absolutely.
All right. Okay, so for the public, I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's fall board budget hearing. Some of you may not be used to us holding hearings, so for members of the public that are tuning in, our board hearing will be for us to just listen to testimony, and our board forums will be more interactive events with board members. Our next board forum will be for parents/guardians and will be held in January. Tonight's hearing will be for us to hear the process of how city schools will be collecting community engagement and designing the FY23 budget. We will also be hearing items you think the board should be prioritizing in our next budget. I want to turn it over now to Courtenay Dasante. I'm so sorry, I messed your last name up, Courtenay. I want to turn it over to you for our presentation. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. So my name is Courtenay Desabet. I'm the Special Assistant and Acting Budget Director for the Office of Finance. So I'm going to walk you through our presentation tonight. As Commissioner Richardson outlined, it's a presentation on the process for building school budgets for fiscal year 23, which is quite a unique year. Afterwards, we're going to open up for feedback and comments from the board and community members if there are any on the process and things that we should be considering as we build the budget for next fiscal year. All right, so the agenda, we're going to start with a brief outline on the current landscape, what's special about building the budget this year. We're then going to outline fair funding, or what that means, and then walk through the 10 steps for school budget development, and then open up for any feedback and questions. So the current landscape, as I mentioned, fiscal year 23 is a lot different from how we've built budgets before, and I know every year is different. But this year, the landscape truly is a lot more complex than it has been recently. In any year, there are a lot of things to consider with building a budget. This year, there are a lot more. We have Kerwin, first of all, which completely changes the way that we're funding schools. So there are additional resources coming to schools, but there's also changes in policy and how those resources are used and how those resources are reported after use at the school level and at the district level. So the legislation establishes these new policies for accountability and requirements of schools and school districts, and it alters several existing education formulas and establishes new formulas. So what that means is that we're going to be funding schools on a different model than how we have before. And we as a district are also going to be receiving funding in a different way than how we have before. The other thing to consider this year is, and the same for last year as well, is ESSER and American Rescue Plan funding. So we have access to grant funding at a level that we had not previously, and how that funding is used and applied at the school level and district level in conjunction with Kerwin and in conjunction with a lot of the other activities that are taking place is extremely important this year. The third item we have here is the Reconnect, Restore, and Reimagine, which is our reflection on the commitment to using powerful lessons we've learned through COVID to cover unfinished learning and ultimately support students in reaching their full potential. So we have all these items going on at the same time, and the and more ... at the bottom alludes to a couple other things. So yeah, we made the commitment in fiscal year 19 that at least once every 4 years, we're going to review and revise the Fair Student Funding Formula. So we're at that point now where we need to look at the Fair Student Funding Formula, ascertain whether the formula is working as we intended, or begin the process of making changes or adjustments to the formula. We're going to do this over a 2-year period. So we're going to start it in fiscal year 23 and end in fiscal year 24. As I mentioned, there are already a lot of things taking place this year. And the most significant of them being Kerwin, that impacts the funding formula being Kerwin. So we want to see how Kerwin sort of plays through the formula in a full year before making that assessment, and take that into consideration as we make adjustments to the formula going forward. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about fair student funding. So the Baltimore City Public Schools is not the only district that does a weighted student funding model. We are, I think, currently still the only one in Maryland who does it, but there are a few others around the country, and they use different naming conventions for their weighted funding model. But fair student funding, as we call it in Baltimore City, is essentially the idea that the funding follows the student. So it's used to fund our traditional schools, and it recognizes that our school communities, our school leaders, our families have the best sense of what is ultimately needed at their school. So the school district provides guidelines and parameters, but it's up to the school leader in conjunction with their staff, their families, their community, their students to tune the budgets to make sure it's meeting the needs and goals of that particular school and school environment. It also means that in the instance or cases where students move from one location to the next, the funding for that student moves with them as well. So the goal of fair student funding is to incorporate, all of those changes and all those adjustments, and still try to make that process as seamless as possible. And that's something that we're continuing working on and continually tweaking. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, some of the adjustments we made this year. And our goal for fiscal year 23 is to take all those things that we discussed before in terms of Kerwin and ESSER and R3, and build that into our budget process, but still not lose some of the core items that we've developed over the last few years in terms of improvements to the process. Specifically, and we've heard this on the board before, no matter what we do want to maintain community voice. We do want to maintain community input. We still want to maintain autonomy where possible, and give school leaders the support and tools necessary for the decision-making required for building school budgets. So fair student funding has 5 main, sort of tenets or goals. So equity, like I mentioned, it's the ability for the funding to follow the students, and that the students who need the funding get it the most. We know, and we have seen before, that there's a difference between equity and equality. So it's not just an equal distribution of resources, but it's making sure that every student within their unique scenario has the support and funding that's required. And that's expressed through things like we have weights for high school students, we have weights for students of poverty, we have weights for gifted and talented. So there are different elements of the funding model that allow students to get more specific funding based on their needs. Empowerment, and I discussed this before. This is empowering our school communities and our school leaders to be able to make the decisions that they need for their school communities based on the knowledge that they have. Accountability at the school level and at the district level as well. Innovation and transparency. So a lot of the decision making, and one of the beauties, I should say, of the fair student funding model, despite however it works or it planned to work is that, it always ends up being something a little more nuanced than what's expected or more nuanced than what's on paper. Individual school leaders and ILEDs and district staff find very creative ways to solve complex issues, whether those issues are financial, staffing, or otherwise related. So the model is designed to support that and allow that level of innovation and transparency. So next, I'm going to walk through the 10 stages of school budget development. Step number 1, and where we are right now actually is in the sweet spot between fiscal years. We are in the process of wrapping up step 10 from last year's FY22 budget and going into step 1 for this year's budget, FY23. So we're right at the cusp at the beginning of this part of the process. And step 1 is the priority discussion. So we mentioned that that's something we always wanted to maintain no matter what changes we make based on current. We want to maintain the opportunities that we've provided and continue to provide for community input and for community voice. And this particular item takes 2 main forms. So there's a district level priority engagement where we provide the listing of district level priorities that we seek feedback from the community members on, and that get incorporated into the budget, the final budget in the spring. The other aspect of this is a school level priority discussion. So this is where schools are engaging their community members before they know what their budgets are, before they know what the landscape is really going to look like. They're seeking feedback from their community members as to what their goals and objectives are for the upcoming fiscal year for the school. So they're actively engaging folks. This is the process that we've been tuning over the last few years. The Office of Community Engagement and FCE have done an excellent job in terms of fine-tuning what that looks like, looking at holes or weaknesses in the process, making sure that it's more standardized, from one school to the next, making sure that it's being held with fidelity at all schools. That's something that we received feedback on over the last few years. And this year, they're actually seeking feedback on the process itself. So on the priority discussions and school level engagement, looking to see what works, what doesn't work, what needs to be adjusted going forward. So this process takes place around December, January. At the school level, it actually starts a little earlier. It starts about now in November, but district-wide ends at about January. Step 2 in the process is the enrollment projections. So we mentioned before that funding is based on the individual students and where students go. So we have to fund schools based on projection. Initially when we develop the budgets in the spring. In the fall, and we'll get to that step later on, the enrollment adjustments, we shift student funding based on where students move to. But the initial projections, we develop this now, December and January, around this time of year. And we base it on, the 930 enrollment that just passed for the most part. But it is a little more nuanced. There's some cases based on the schools, if the schools have been in a relatively stable situation for a period of years, we may use 3 or 5 year averages. We try to blend and smooth for any spikes, things that may occur because of parameters beyond the school's control. We look at grade by grade progressions for our projections. So we look at cohorts as they move from one grade to the next as one of the measures. And ultimately, we also do kind of take circumstances into account, unique circumstances, for example, schools moving into and out of swing space, closures, housing closures in neighborhoods or relocations or, things that may impact enrollment in a specific school. And we also, send the initial calculations out to the schools themselves for feedback. So the school leaders have an opportunity to see the initial projections, give feedback on those projections. We don't always, take, the feedback as is. They may say, for example, no, I think, my projection is going to be much higher. I spoke to a number of families, and, they indicated that they're going to be interested in attending. But we'll have to balance that against, feedback that we receive from other schools, the pie being the pie, so to speak, or the population being relatively set or static. It isn't an infinite number of students, so we have to kind of play those against each other to see where we end up with the final figures. But we do let principals give feedback, and in a lot of cases, we do take that feedback, and then we share out the final enrollment projections with the schools, which is what we use for the spring budgeting. The next step, SPPs are school performance plans. So we try to ensure that the budget planning process is in alignment with the academic goals for the school. So this is the part of the process where, not specifically financial related, we do incorporate into the budget development process, because we don't want budgets being built that don't take these factors into account, that take the long-term goals for the school and school community, as well as the individual, year-to-year metrics that are measured for schools. So this part of the process takes that into account as we go through the community engagement and the budget development for each individual school. And this also takes place in about February, when we're going into budget building. Next, school community budget forums. So I should have said on the onset that there are, 3 main avenues for schools in terms of community engagement. So the first we mentioned before is the priority conversations, which take place in November and December. And the second is there's the school community budget forum. So this is taking place in the spring. So this is before schools have their collaboratives. They now know what their budget allocations are. They've already had conversations with their community members as to what's important, what they should be prioritizing going forward. So they start to flesh out a preliminary budget, and they engage their community members on the specifics, or some of the specifics, on building that budget. So if we had feedback that something priority A was important and something that we should incorporate, this is a step where we look at how exactly is priority A built into the budget. What can we afford? What can we not afford? What do we have to compromise on? What is a non-negotiable? So they have those conversations with the community members, with the schools, with the teachers, the staff, and they bring that to the table when they're building their budgets and the budget collaboratives, which is step 5, the budget collaboratives. So this is one aspect. While I said before, we're not unique in terms of having weighted funding model, the budget collaboratives, one of the steps, the budget collaborative process, I should say, is one of the steps where we are a bit unique. There are very few districts that, bring in every single school for a collaborative, sit them down at a table with support. So we bring in, the Office of Human Capital, the budget analysts, the special ed, folks from the Office of Special Education, folks from Title I and Grants Office. So there's support from SCE, there's support from all the different departments. And they sit at the table with the school leader and the ILED and the school support manager as we build the budgets for each school. So the school leader comes with a plan. They come with something loaded into the budget to them already. But we walk through every item that's in there. We look at the staffing. We look at the OTPS, meaning other than personnel allocations. We look at the how it melds with their performance plans. We look at how it incorporates their same documentation, the community engagement feedback. We look at to make sure that it's meeting all the MSD requirements and all the minimum guidelines that we set out in budget guidance. If you need to have a certain amount of guidance counselors, et cetera. And we look at how they can utilize the different resources that they have available. So not just their general fund or traditional fair student funding dollars, but if there are things that can be supported by their grant dollars, or in the case of this coming year, there are $3 and some of the other initiatives that are taking place. So we do that collaboratively at a table with the principal, where we have a feel for and a story for each individual school. So every school budget is built uniquely, and no school budget is built in isolation. The principal is taking the information and feedback from their community, from their students and from their families, and they're getting supported by the staff from central office who have their own items that they want to make sure that schools are looking out for and keeping track of as they build their budgets, and supporting schools to build a proper comprehensive budget. So the budget collaborative is a very important part of the process, something that we didn't always used to bring in every school. It used to be that we'd do it for small schools, or just schools who had financial constraints. But I think it was one of the best improvements was expanding that to include all schools, even though it's time intensive, not just for schools, but also for central office staff, who essentially have to set aside 3 weeks of all day meetings with schools. But I think the benefits are fairly obvious in terms of the support that's provided, and it's not just needed for schools, like I said, that are in financial constraints. Schools that have larger budgets benefit greatly from the process as well. Next step, the community budget review. So this is the third part of the community engagement, school level community engagement. So this is after schools have come in, built their budgets, we've done the collaborative sessions, and then school leaders go back to their community members and say, here's the final result. So, I know you asked me for this and you said that this was a priority. We went into the collaboratives, and here, through the collaborative process and all those different forms of input that I mentioned, here's where the budget ended up. So they go back to their community and sort of an accountability measure to say, well, I guess on one hand, to make sure that folks are aware of what the budget is, but also it's another level of transparency where folks understand the transition between what they initially asked for and where it ended up. School leaders are explaining, why things changed, or if nothing changed, just explaining, this is where we ended up and this is what we were able to get. In some cases, it may be that they identified or were able to be helped with finding additional resources for priority. So maybe they were able to do things that they weren't planning to initially. So this is the follow-up conversation to say, yes, this is what we planned, and here's where we ended up in terms of the final budget submission. Next, we have budget approval. So this step is more, administrative, I'd say. So a lot of the same folks who are at the table during the collaboratives from the various offices are doing the approval. So they're going through and checking each school budget that's submitted for compliance, making sure that it's meeting COMA requirements and our various different budget guidance requirements, and we have specialists in each office that approve the school budgets, every single budget, and they go through a queue. So if there are changes made to a budget, it has to be resubmitted and go through, so everyone's aware of whatever has been changed or how it fits in with the budget process. Next, the board budget vote. So this is the part where the board votes on the budget, the final budget product, or I guess semi-final budget product. The board also has an opportunity or a period. This year we've extended that period a little bit, so it's going to be 4 weeks between when the budget is initially presented and when the budget is voted on. We're also try to engage the board with updates, during the budget development process as well, so they have an idea of like revenue and allocations and some of the other constraints or parameters that schools are facing. But this is where it's all packaged together. So the district level engagement and communication with community members and voting on the district level spending, the school level individual allocations and spending, and the grants processes and everything else are all packaged up into the final budget document, which is the budget book and budget presentation. And we start the process of engaging the board and making sure the board is aware of anything that they want to be aware of with regards to the budget. We're seeking community input and feedback during that 4-week process, 4-week timeline as well. Folks will review the budget document and note anything that they want to have, a deeper dive on, and ask for the questions on who want to see in a different way. And ask questions, about the budget. Are certain things that they have as priorities covered, or are there initiatives that were done or not done? So we go through that, sort of Q&A period of examining the budget to make sure that we're putting out a budget that everyone is satisfied with. Once the budget is passed, then we get into staffing. So this is, going into the summer period, the budget's passed, we have an allocation. We start the staffing process of building, school rosters and central office based on, what was put into the budget in the spring and what was voted on. So in a lot of instances, like I said, this is preliminary, like in terms of schools, because it's based on the allocation, the enrollment that we came up in the spring, but subject to change based on the last step, which we'll get to, which is the enrollment adjustments within certain parameters. So step 10, the end of the process, I mentioned a couple of times, enrollment adjustments. So this is the fair student funding, dollars follow the child, the prioritization of resources, making sure that resources go where they're needed most. And the enrollment adjustments facilitates that. It allows us to make changes or edits to the allocations that schools receive based on where students end up moving to on their September 30th enrollment. This year, we really made it a priority, this year being fiscal year 22, to try and mitigate the disruption caused by enrollment adjustments We adjusted the process so that we reduced the number of schools that would have to experience enrollment adjustments. We also were able to set aside some funding so we could bolster the per pupil to mitigate the change for the schools that did actually receive enrollment adjustment increases or decreases. And even then, we also changed the percentage to which those were applied. So instead of a school that would have lost, 100% of whatever it was they would have lost based on enrollment change, we brought that down to about 50%, or not about, but to 50% of what their loss would have been otherwise. Same on the increases. So the goal being to reduce the number of transactions that have to take place, reduce the number of positions that have to be shifted from school to school after the school year is already started, and we're 2 months into the school year. Students are familiar with the staff and teachers. Reduce some of the uncertainty for staff as well, who know at this time of year that there's a possibility they're going to get moved from one school to the next or have position changes. So we think we've succeeded with that, a bit this year. At least the feedback so far, we're still going through the process, has been pretty good. So we're hoping to, identify ways in which we can sort of incorporate the lesson learned from this going forward. The process may look a little bit different, in subsequent years. It's not something that we may necessarily always be able to sustain. We're going to have to figure out, the funding source that we can use going forward. But it was a good and pilot for this year, for fiscal year 22. And we want to see how we can also improve on that and add to it going forward in fiscal year 23 and onwards. So enough of me, blabbing on. This is the portion, I guess, where we open up for feedback and questions from the board and from community members, right?
Commissioner Fadden, you there?
I'm here. Good evening, Courtney.
Good evening, sir.
I'm not sure if any of my board colleagues have any questions or concerns, but we'll open it up as Courtney just said. Christian, are there any members of the public who've signed up to speak?
No, so it's just your questions.
The process is fairly straightforward, as it has been in years past. Courtney, I appreciate you being here to review the process with the few commissioners that are here, but are there any questions from the commissioners that are present? Questions, thoughts? Commissioner Roberts.
Thank you, Vice Chair McFadden, and thank you so much, Courtney, for the presentation. I don't have much to offer outside of, I really appreciate, I think it was slide 4, where you were able to offer the differentiated funding opportunities that will be afforded to the district moving forward. I think the larger community should best understand the different pots of money that will be afforded to the system and how they will be used. And what they cannot be used for. It's two sides of that coin. And even as we, in this budget season, I know each year we get a little better at doing this, but offering in plain language how they can see that reflected within their school communities, especially in the work with R3. And even as we work towards implementing that various elements that the new Kerwin law, I want to add law in there, will require us to implement in this year's budgetary season as we're moving forward. So thank you again for the presentation. And we will continue to see and hear updates within the operations committee around your work and efforts, your community engagement efforts, especially for this year's budget creation.
And Commissioner Roberts, actually, your comment was convenient because Courtney's already aware in January, right? The budget update will include some of this landscape information on this slide. So the operations budget update in January.
Yeah, that's correct.
I appreciate that, Commissioner Roberts. Courtney, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, sir. Courtney with an A.
Courtney. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that it was, I think I've always pronounced it correctly, but I'm big on names. So I appreciate you I'm saying that. Commissioner Roberts, I appreciate you highlighting these particular items as it relates to community engagement. I think that it's really important that the community and all of our stakeholders understand the implications of the blueprint, right? As we've called it as Kerwin, and as you just mentioned, it is law. Courtney, I'm interested in knowing, or I guess Commissioner Roberts, I'm sure you'll be able to fill us in also as the chair of operations, how we will be communicating these updates as they come, as they've already started to come, but how we'll be communicating these to the greater public so that they understand, to your point, how it impacts them, right? How does it impact me? How does it impact my student, my child, my school, and my community? So are we able to talk any at all at this point about how we're going to make sure that the community and all of our stakeholders are aware of particularly the top two, the blueprint, right? And then the American Rescue Plan. Reconnect, Restore, and Imagine is it's what we own as it relates to those two. But is there any discussion around how we're planning to do that moving forward?
Yes, there is. So in addition to our monthly ops committee, sharing and engagement on these items, actually, I want to backtrack 1 second because there's something very important that Commissioner Roberts said that I don't want to get lost, was that it's not just the fact that we're getting more money, but like what the restrictions are around those dollars. But that's something that we want to make sure we communicate. I think a lot of times folks see the dollars and it's just like, wow, there's all this money. But there are very strict parameters as to how that money can be used, and also the reporting that goes along with that, and the proof that the money has been spent in that regard and is yielding results for that specific item. So that's a big part of Kerwin. Accountability is a huge part of Kerwin. And with the ARPA dollars, the American Rescue Plan and ESSER dollars, those are grant dollars, and with any grant dollars, they're also very strict, restrictions. These are looser than most, but there's strict restrictions as to how they can be used and what they can be spent on. So that's very important. But back to your point, we will be doing the ops committee updates on a monthly basis. We also have a work group, which we were talking about earlier, starts tomorrow, an internal work group that is helping us to flesh together the implementation plan that we have to submit to MSD. So it's actual deliverable for the district based on Kerwin implementation. So what that is the sort of the comprehensive implementation for Baltimore City Public Schools. That it's sort of our homework that we have to turn in on Kerwin in the first year, but it's something that we do want to share with the board and with the community members, not just when the plan is fully built, but sort of as we're going through the process and seeking collaboration and feedback on that. So we're working on setting up the timeline for that outgoing engagement. What we have at this point, like I was mentioning, is the internal work group, which is starting tomorrow. And that group would help us flesh out what the long-range communications plan is. It's something we've also started discussing with our partners in communications and FCE and started to think through the levels of engagement. We're also cognizant of the fact that we have a lot of things going on as a district. It's something not just from staff, but community members in terms of identifying how our message is best, or messaging time, I guess, is best spent. Folks have heard from us on ESSER, and they've heard from us on R3, and they've heard from us on Blueprint and different elements. So making sure as we go through the fiscal year 23 budget development process, we're trying to streamline the process of communication and workload where possible. So, kind of going back to the enrollment adjustment, that's part of the thought process there. Again, reducing some of the impact and workload on staff. It's something we've heard from principals and teachers, the number of reports and meetings that they have to attend and different steps in the process. So as we build out the budgets and we're using Kerwin and we're using ARPA and we're integrating these things together, we're trying to do so in a thoughtful way to sort of, streamline the messaging, streamline the workload. It is a very ambitious budget building year, with all these changes. So as much as possible, we want to break that up into, digestible chunks for our community and for our partners.
I appreciate that. And Commissioner Roberts, if we're going to have these ongoing updates and operations, I would ask if you could specifically mention them in your reporting back to the full board?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Vice Chair.
No, it will just be really helpful if this is, an ongoing process. I think it's important to just, it doesn't have to be elongated, but just touching on some of those updates that we're receiving about it in our monthly sharing after our committee meetings. I think it will be helpful. For members like, I'm taking it personal for members like me that are on operations.
Yeah, we do plan to have, when we get to that stage, a presentation we can make to the full board as well. That gives more of a summative update on the current process and where we reach at that point in the process. But that probably won't be till about, January or February when we're in the swing of, and we have an idea of what the allocation looks like and some of those other elements.
Yeah, and Commissioner Roberts, the reason why I'm saying is because she does a great job in making sure that we're informed. So I just know that is another avenue to make sure that the board is aware, besides those full board presentations coordinated that you all are preparing to do. That's all. But I appreciate the work. Commissioner Chinya, do you have any thoughts or clarifying thoughts or questions?
No, I would concur with most of, all of what you all have said. The piece that I would just like to highlight is I really appreciated the way you laid out all of the steps to the process, of the budget process, and putting aside all, the current slide that we're on that I know is extremely important. I think we also want to be certain that we're reminding those school family councils and folks and other folks in the community where we are in that process, so that they're aware. That's been the thing that we hear every year, that people don't know what's happening, and all of a sudden the budget is there. And I think you've really laid it out very clearly. This was the most appropriate time, I believe it or not, since this is American Education Week. So if people are aware of that, then they can start their work of advocacy and of transparency and of knowledge building. But thank you so much. This was a great presentation. And I guess my other question is this particular presentation or a form of it going out to the schools as they are having those meetings with families and community?
This specific presentation, no, but there's a full packet that schools receive to guide them through the community meetings with their families. So the FCE team puts together a full packet in terms of agendas, timelines, what sort of documents, how to format your meeting, how to set up the interaction. It is it's become more prescriptive by intent. We do want to make sure that there's consistency between how schools, implement this. So some of it has been done or developed in conjunction with the school leaders who've been doing this and doing it well. So there's a full packet that schools receive on that, but it doesn't include this specific presentation.
Okay, but I would just encourage you to be certain that somewhere, that there is the idea of that full timeline and all of the parts of the process for schools to know. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good recommendation. I don't think we included a high level timeline. If anything, maybe the couple slides that show what those 10 steps are might be useful for schools just to reference the sequence of events. I think that's a good suggestion.
Thank you.
The teacher and me, of course, is going to provide some wait time for additional thoughts. We have diverse learners and members, so I want to make sure we give the time. And of course, coordinate if we have any additional questions. I saw Commissioner Roberts come off mute. We'll be sure to send them in. When I think about Kerwin and the blueprint, I think about a lot of, and I know that we're wrapping up, we're not going to be long, but I think about school systems, jurisdictions, LEAs in the state as a whole, right? The infrastructure, and are our systems prepared to implement the blueprint? And so it makes me think about it, because if, as Commissioner Roberts is saying, this is now something that our General Assembly has voted on, right? It's not something that we're turning back to say, no, we can't do it. No, we don't have the ability to implement. So it just, as we're having this discussion tonight, it's just making me think, are we ready to implement what Kerwin is asking for us, the blueprint is asking us to implement? And it's not just our jurisdiction, but it's jurisdictions all across the state. And so one of the reasons, Commissioner Roberts, I'm asking for those updates just as regularly as you possibly can afford them to us from what is happening in your committee as it relates to this. It's just to keep us abreast on how we are prepping to implement that, and then how we're being good stewards over the American Rescue Plan funds as well. So it's just a thought that I had. Commissioner Roberts, I did see you come off mute as well. I didn't know if you wanted to add something.
Yes, there were actually two things that bubbled up for me. One of which is with the internal work group that Courtney mentioned, the Kerwin internal work group, which is basically made up of various components of the district, departments and such, and they're working through the restrictive nature of each of these funding sources and what implementation in real time will look like. I think about my participation on the blueprint implementation task force for May.
You see why I'm asking you to give us some help.
I know. But I think about that and where they find challenges and need better guidance how to lift that. Because if we as a district are encountering these issues, other jurisdictions are also looking for guidance around those same areas, or maybe other areas that we haven't encountered just yet. But I also, in this space, before we end tonight, I'd be absolutely remiss to not create a space for Commissioner Horowitz to offer any perspective that may have bubbled up for her during this conversation, because Commissioner McFadden, during our quarterly meetings that we have with ASCDC, I would be really, really interested in how we can get more student voice in this process, and how we could best use our student commissioner, Commissioner Horowitz, to kind of communicate in plain language for our students what this process is, how it's meaningful, and to also get some of that meaningful feedback back to us, so that we are ultimately working for the students, and to have some of that perspective always at the forefront of each conversation. So, not to put you on the spotlight, Commissioner Horowitz, but kind of to put you on the spotlight. Does anything, or do you have anything to contribute to tonight's discussion just yet, or do you think that you need some time to kind of process this very multifaceted process?
And forgive me, I didn't see that Commissioner Horowitz was with us. So good afternoon or good evening, Commissioner Horowitz. Are you with us, Commissioner?
She was.
Commissioner Horowitz, are you there? If you have any thoughts on this process, we want to hear from you.
Perhaps she's having tech challenges, but we'll circle back, and I'll make sure that, to your point, Commissioner McFadden, that I keep Commissioner Horowitz abreast of the updates as well.
Yeah, that's important. Are there any with your work with the state, Commissioner Roberts, are there any students represented there with you all?
With the exception of the two jurisdictions that have fully voting right members, student members of their board, no. And those are the only two that have been consistently participating. On the Blueprint Ad Hoc Task Force Committee, there are no student representation. There is no student representation currently. But what I will say, a nuance to that is the student member of the state board does serve as a partner in the conversation. But there are no students that have been selected for that particular task.
Great. So, well, not great, but we have an opportunity to make sure that our student commissioner is included. So I appreciate you for raising that. Coordinator, do you have any questions or asks or thoughts of the board in this particular stage of the process?
Well, I will say one thing that I think worked particularly well last year was we did engage the board on like some specifics, like in terms of like how do we want to structure some of the items in the budget book, or how do we want to disseminate information. And I thought that feedback was really good. I am always more relaxed when we get to May if I feel like, you know, you guys are getting your questions answered during the process and you guys are feeling that you're knowledgeable about the process. So I just encourage that, you know, if there are questions as we go through the development process, or if there are areas that you want us to dig in more on or provide more information on, just to let us know. And, you know, we'll be happy to provide and support. So
I appreciate that.
I was gonna, you know, sort of, we have these blueprint coordinator meetings with the other districts and the other LEAs. And in those, you know, we see a lot of like what Commissioner Roberts was mentioning, and you touched on yourself, where, you know, from district to district, the interpretation, you know, can be so different, and you know, different districts are raising issues and concerns. So it is very interesting to kind of see how folks are interpreting the legislation. And I think there's kind of a sense too of fiscal year 23 being, I want to say, we'll do the best we can sort of year. Like, I think everyone has a sense of like, it's not going to be perfect in the first year. And some of it is going to be, you know, based on the feedback and on the process. And there's still some things that MSD is working out and haven't fully answered, you know, some of the questions that we have on. So we're working through that likewise, you know, with other districts, and I guess in collaboration with other districts too, who we're kind of lending our voices to get responses on certain items and get support on certain things. And we have had a couple interactions with MSD in that regard as well too. So some of it, like I said, we're hoping for things to become more concrete in the near future. But there's a sense of expectation that, you know, as we go through it this year, there's gonna be some lessons learned, you know, for going forward long term.
I appreciate that. And that's good for us to keep in our brains as well. What I'm going to ask and encourage all of us to do as my board colleagues is we've adopted networks, right? We've adopted CLNs. I would encourage all of us to make sure that we are at least up to date or abreast to when these budget meetings are happening in the schools within the networks that we've adopted, so that will inform our questions and what we're asking of staff to answer as it relates to the budget for this upcoming year. We want to make sure that our thought process is well-rounded and indicative of information provided to us from the greater Baltimore City community. So I would encourage all of us to do that, make sure that we're at least asking our ILEDs and the schools that we're attending or visiting, just when are your budget meetings, right? When are your community budget meetings? When are your school family council meetings? So we can actually hear a little bit more from the communities that we're serving as it relates to their needs, their desires for our students as it relates to the budget. Any other questions or thoughts before we end tonight? Again, Coordinator, thank you so much for your work. It's always great to hear you and see you, whether it is virtually during this particular time of year. And to Commissioner Chinya's point, our Chair Emeritus, this is National American Education Week. This is Education Week all over the country. And I know that we're not simply recognizing and celebrating our educators, but we're recognizing everyone that makes our schools schools, right? So all of our support staff, everyone, our related service providers, everyone who is involved in making sure that our young people are safe, that they're well, and that they're moving forward. So I encourage all of us to make sure, and even our central office staff, because they are ones that help our schools to move. So happy American Education Week to each of you. Make sure that you celebrate your colleagues this week. To all of my board members, happy American Education Week to you all, because certainly this is not an easy task, but we're committed to service for the sake of our children. So if we keep that in mind, we'll be able to move forward and do our very best work for children because they need us. I hope that you all have a very great evening. And also a very happy Thanksgiving if you're celebrating that next week, because the board will not meet next week as the board has voted to make sure that our calendar has been adjusted to ensure the rest and the wholeness and the well-being of all of us. So take care, and we will see you next in December. Take care, everyone. Have a great evening.
Have a great evening.
Thank
Good
you.
evening.
Bye-bye.
Good night, thanks.